We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Hi, Emily. Thank you for joining today. For all our listeners who aren't aware of who you are, it'd be great to just get a general background of what you've done and what you're currently up to.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Sunil. It's a pleasure to get to meet you and to follow your commentary on Twitter and such like that. Always neat to be able to meet people from around the world through online communication. So right now I'm a mom who lives in Texas. I moved to Texas during uh, kind of after COVID, after really getting really frustrated with what was happening, and I got frustrated enough that I ran for Congress, and then my husband got as frustrated as I was, and we decided to just cut bait and move from. We were living in Massachusetts previously. Prior to that time, kind of at the beginning of COVID, I had been running a startup for about 7 years, and COVID sort of put that out of its misery. And then during COVID, ended up just really, frankly, initially being sort of surprised by the course things took. My background is in biochemistry, and so when things first took off, I started just doing the things that I usually do when I have a scientific question. I went to the primary literature and started reading everything I could to figure out, to try and see what my risk was, what my kids' risk was, what my parents' risk was. And then kind of discussing it with people, started to realize that all of a sudden, like, things that should have been fairly normal conversations were just really quickly shut off. And that it was just odd it was the information landscape was really strange, and to me it really didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I felt like during that time, just kind of ended up diving into uh, really just trying to understand what was happening, and trying to engage, trying to find others who were also confused, and or who shared my confusion is probably a better way, and not so much confusion about what was about the disease, but confusion about the policy response, and confusion about why the why previously liberal people were now taking what I viewed as really illiberal positions. And ultimately that led to a I guess, a kind of advocacy. And just oddly, very much through Twitter initially, like I remember like writing doing lots and lots and lots of analysis and writing lots of things and trying to share it with people. I went around to my friends and would would send them my newest analysis, saying, here's your most recent Emily Burns propaganda. I'd appreciate it if you'd read it. And counter propaganda, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, I was trying to be lighthearted about getting people to have these conversations. And obviously doing it, writing on some random site was not very helpful. And I'd never been active in on social media or on Twitter since 2000. I joined in 2009, but hadn't really posted anything. And then at a certain point, in order to try and get the things that I was writing to more than a few hundred views, I thought, well, maybe I should look at Twitter and see what's happening there. And then it was really surprising to me just to see that actually there was a discussion going on, that where it wasn't just the three articles that we'd seen in Stat News and the Wall Street Journal from John Ioannidis and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff. There was actually a really active and conversation that was being had, and very intelligent, really well sourced, and ended up joining that conversation and connecting with the other people who were engaged in that conversation. It was sort of surprising to me just how it did actually matter. Everybody says Twitter's not real life, and it's not real life, and it's really dangerous to get sucked into it. but it does have a huge impact on the conversations, and particularly back then when that's where all of the journalists were. So what we were doing, the random group of randos on Twitter was arguing with arguing with the journalists, arguing with the scientists, arguing and bringing the data from the CDC, from the HHS. Like, we created dashboards using their data because they weren't creating the dashboards, and then maybe like a year later they'd finally create a dashboard that looked just like ours. And it, yeah, similarly, yeah, watching trends across the world, watching policies across the world, watching what was happening in the UK, what was happening in Germany, what was happening in France, what was happening in Sweden. And that was it was a very interesting time. And as I said, it got me so frustrated that in the beginning of summer 2021, I said to my husband, I either want to move or I'm going to run for Congress to force a conversation about this, because I was living in Massachusetts,
Right.
about 4 hours north of New York at the time. Um, in I kind of what I call the heart of the medical scholastic industrial complex, like right by Harvard, right by MGH. Rochelle Walensky, the former CDC director, lived down the street from me. It was very much like that. People were true believers on the science, and finding people who were even willing to talk about it was really challenging. And the ones who were like, it ended up being a really class-based response, where if you even just nobody of any level of education or affluence was willing to discuss the potential harms of our policies, because it was just an instant way to get labeled as MAGA. You're MAGA,
Yeah.
and you're just following the propaganda. It's like, it's the opposite. Like,
It sounds so
so
similar to what was going on in the UK. I think that's what was amazing about Twitter X at that time, was we could see parallels in what's going on in America, and you kind of realized that there was like-minded individuals across the world who are all fighting the same thing, and it's not just you don't feel isolated and alone, that you're having these questions or these thoughts. I want to take it back to something where you said you now live in Texas. I visited Texas quite a long time ago before COVID. I absolutely loved it. I went to Austin. Um, I've heard this being a reoccurring theme amongst Americans that I've spoken to in the last few years, of them moving to Texas. Is that because the laws were less restrictive? I know there's less taxes, but is that just a reoccurring theme now across America, people moving towards Texas?
I think Texas, Florida, Utah, Wyoming, various. And yes, it's because we've got this federal system. The state laws are all very different, and so it's really, even when Joe Biden wanted to impose a nationwide mask mandate, he couldn't do it except for to do it. He tried to do it via the employers. That was the way he tried to get around it, using OSHA, which is our Occupational Safety Health Association or standards or something like that. It's very hard for the federal government to force all of us to do the same thing, which makes it so that or all of the states to do the same thing, which means you should have you do have these different laboratories telling you what's happening in different places. So you actually have the ability to see, oh, if these people take one policy, what's happening there versus what are the results. But instead of looking at that and learning from that, there was an attempt. The attempts were just all around kind of screwing with the data. But yeah, so Texas both. So yeah, there's no state income tax. There's still federal income tax, of course, and very high sales tax, and property tax. But it's a very different people. The people are, it's just much more, because it's a state that is far less focused on regulating things. It's a little bit more of a, you know, ask forgiveness rather than permission. And for me, this was brought home kind of strongly one of the first, in the first few months when I was here. We were driving with some friends to a University of Texas football game, and I looked out the window, and somebody's walking a longhorn, which is a kind of cow that's got horns that are literally like 8 feet wide. And I was like, is that legal? And he's like, I don't know. And then going a little further along, maybe 2 blocks further, I see kids driving down in a truck, and the kids are in the back. And is that legal? Legal? And he turns and said, we just don't really think that way. Like we're like, if we're not hurting other people, and then we're not really, and we're being responsible. And that's just not how people are here. And it's definitely, and you see it actually really a lot in this, in the civic institutions, and the way that uh, the the schools and the parents of the schools will organize just by themselves to do things that, frankly, even just that level of organization wouldn't have been allowed in Massachusetts, because it would be considered that parents doing that is creating an inequitable situation for other kids somewhere else in the state. So it's a lot more. There's an openness that is to there's an openness to the people, and then there's an openness to the society that is really refreshing.
I certainly felt that in the 2 weeks that I was there. I'd spent quite a lot of time in New York previously, and I could notice the difference was drastic. When you're talking about kids in terms of schools in Massachusetts versus Texas, what's the difference? Like as a parent, you kind of alluded to it a little bit there. Is the difference in laws? What's taught at schools? Is it all pretty much the same, or is there some sort of differences?
There are there are definitely different laws, but I think one of the bigger things is just the influence of the teachers unions in Texas is significantly less. I haven't checked, but I would be shocked if it's not a right to work state, which that's a law that we have here that makes it so that people are not, you don't have to be a member to be a part of, to be in the school, to teach at the schools. And the teachers unions were such a huge part of causing, I mean, of so many bad policies, well beyond schools actually, in during COVID, at least here. They, the way that they leaned on the CDC, the way that and there are now emails and various other things that demonstrate that. So I think that because the teachers unions are, not so strong, that means you end up with, the parents drive a little bit more. It doesn't mean it's perfect. Austin's still, I mean, no place is perfect, right? And it's and Austin is still like, we are a blue dot in the middle of a Red Sea, and it's parts of Austin are extremely, and I know your labels are switched, or your colors are switched.
Yeah.
But it Austin is Austin Austin in the city is can be kind of viciously woke,
Yeah.
and but it's frankly grounded in the rest of Texas, which it is a nice it creates a nice compromise.
I think what's interesting with the teachers aspect, we actually had a head teacher on this show recently who essentially lost his job because he spoke out against the vaccines. He didn't really say a lot. He just said, I think I'm not sure if kids should necessarily get the vaccine. There should be a bit more research done on it. I'm not going to enforce it at school, but like, I think there should be a bit more, just research and data around it. And he said this quite early on during the pandemic, and he was removed as a teacher in the UK. And there's been a reoccurring sort of discussion in the UK of what the role of a teacher is. So we've often found in the UK that teachers are almost taking on the role as parents in some cases, and some cases I think there's a genuineness where maybe there's lack of parenting at home, but in other cases there seems to be them taking on that responsibility and almost making the parents' role a bit redundant. And I think it's a bit worrying here in the UK. Is that a similar sort of theme in the US?
It definitely is. There's and the steps that they've actually tried to do to sideline parents in certain states is really disturbing. For instance, and I think you see that especially with the trans stuff. For instance, there are states where they will transition children, do the social transitions at school, and make sure they don't inform their parents. States where parents can be, where parent where parents can lose custody of their children if they're not supportive of the transition, or and similarly, like and a lot of that does go end up going through the does go through the teachers. I mean, not that custody type thing, but I think the sort of initial inculcation and support. And it's just, as a parent, it's just incredibly frustrating because you have when you when your child has challenges, you're trying to deal with them, you're trying to understand, and the idea of having somebody in that position undermine the efforts that you're doing to try and help that child cope are kind of, it's really beyond me. I actually think a really interesting, if perhaps TMI kind of story that illustrates this in a way that people would that makes more sense is, so I was bulimic in high school. Imagine if my teachers had said, this is a fundamental part of your being. You're being able to throw up, and your parents trying to help you through this with counseling. They are, yeah, they are really standing in the way of you being you, or other various other mental challenges that people have, and it's really frustrating, and I think it definitely creates a sense of, well, it sows distrust.
Oh, definitely. And like, I think questions of role, what's even the point of parenting in that case when your teacher's taking on this role, and what right does the teacher almost have to do that with the child? And I think it is worrying when they have so much influence, because then they can start putting their influence on it with their political beliefs and their social beliefs and all this sort of stuff. So I think it's a serious problem in the UK, and by the sound of things, it's similar in the States. And so it's, yeah, definitely something to be worried about. Was that I'm guessing, one of many reasons that you decided to run to be a congresswoman? Was this all part of the making of this, or would you say it's one of the main reasons, or was there other issues that you thought were that had to be solved?
For me, the biggest reason that I ran was uh, to force conversations on the COVID policies, but they are all sort of interlinked. At this point, I feel like I've gone down so many rabbit holes, and I'm sure you have too, that you realize that actually what it is it's just like an interconnected warren of lies that is supporting this like brittle edifice of our society, which I think is why, yeah, the more pressure you put on it, like, yeah, it gets, keep seeing that it buckling. And it's why if that's your foundation, I think it makes much more sense why, for us, the more money we put into things via the government, the worse they get. You know, our school outcomes are getting worse and worse, and we spend at last check we spend more per child on education than everybody except for three countries, one of which I believe is, so it's Norway, I think Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, I can't remember which, and one other one. And I mean, we are spending the money, and the results just keep getting worse and worse. Ditto with healthcare. And so you wonder, well, why isn't that the case? Realistically, we should be the smartest, the healthiest, instead of getting dumber and dumber and fatter more and more unhealthy. And I think it's because this is the this is the foundation upon which our society is built. It is just this literal warren of lies that is incredibly brittle, and they are all interconnected. And so yes, that was a big part of why I ran. I just wanted to force the conversation, and I figured I would be able to force that conversation because and at the time it was around vaccine mandates and mask mandates and school mask mandates. And this was, mind you, this is late 2021. And my kids were still masked in school until March of 2022, which I believe is quite a bit longer than your y'all's kids were. And that, and we did this polling right at the beginning of my campaign, and it was my consultants basically trying to say, you don't really want to talk about this, and because school mask mandates were extremely popular. Like 65% of people in my district supported the school mask mandates, even though at that time, the vaccines had been out for ages. Adults hadn't been forced to mask for months and months and months. It was really popular, and I just thought, I okay, I get it. I just think that the conversation's been stifled. And they said, but if you go after this, you're probably going to lose. I said, well, I don't care. The only reason I'm running is to force this conversation. And I think that uh, I'm a little bit hard to say, well, she's just some, know nothing MAGA idiot, and dismiss me. And I think it was to me, it was a really positive experience. I did withdraw before the election. I left, as I said, my husband got as frustrated as I was, frankly, with the Boston vaccine mandates, which went into place well after it was known that the vaccine didn't stop transmission. And at that point, then our kids couldn't go into Boston, and we're trustees of the museum and the ballet, and our kids can't go there. We couldn't go there if we weren't boosted. And it was frankly, it was immoral anyway. We refused to actually go into the city at all because it just didn't seem like a moral thing to be doing. And actually, what happened is we were talking through everything. Uh, we were talking through, just gaming through what happens if you win, can you change? Because specifically, the guy who is running to be governor of the state for the Republicans asked me if I was interested in running as his lieutenant governor. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, let's say somehow you win. Let's say you guys win this race and you become governor. What do you think is going to happen? And we just walked through everything and just gamed it out, and realized that not going to make a difference here. It's too much of an uphill battle. And that's when he said, well, should we just move? And I said, well, I've wanted to since November of 2020, which is when we had an outdoor mask mandate imposed and gathering limits of 10 and under, which I'm sure that you guys, I think, had even worse at that time. I think you were in the middle of your second lockdown. And but it was at that point we just decided to leave. And it we booked a flight down to Austin because Austin was sort of the only place for us that overlapped between a place uh, where we felt that we would be sufficiently politically insulated from the utter insanity, and a place where where he could start a new office.
Well,
So
what's crazy about this? Everything you pretty much said there, you've been proven to be right now. We now know as a fact in 2025 that everything you said there is masks were ineffective, that the vaccine wasn't giving, stop transmission. All the things you've said are all facts. And what's really frustrating is it's changed people's lives that didn't need to be changed had they just been a bit more open to conversation, which is really upsetting and disturbing. When you were running as congressman, what was the response like in Massachusetts? By the sound of things, I'm guessing it probably wasn't all positive from that environment you were around. But what was that actual experience like? Did you get a lot of abuse for some of your views on COVID and stuff, or were people quite open, or what was that general experience?
independent. I think that sorry, I started on this and then didn't finish. It was an incredibly positive experience because there were a lot of people who reached out and were saying thank you so much for saying these things. And one person reached out and said, I've donated over $100,000 to Democrats. I've never voted for a Democrat before. I worked for Dianne Feinstein. I've never seen propaganda like this in my entire life, and you're the first Republican I'll be voting for. And there were a lot of things like that. uh, the media was an interesting. The few experiences that I had were interesting because basically they what they do is they try and ignore you if you. The district is so far left that they would have ignored me until if I possibly broke 40%, then they probably would have tried to destroy me. And everything is, but it was amazing how everything had to be slanted. Like absolutely everything was slanted. There was one interview that I went into, or it was supposed to be kind of puff local TV thing, um, and and I was supposed to be interviewing some, just another the host, right? And instead, they brought in, and they didn't tell me, they brought in the guy who had been the runner-up for the governor's Democratic nomination for governor in the prior time. So somebody who had a lot, like who who was who was going to have a very strongly political slant to everything, who had a lot of experience, a whole lot more experience doing it than I did, and they brought him in basically just to railroad me. It was really, it was interesting. So that in that time, that was the first time that I had somebody accuse me of misinformation, and it was specifically with regard to talking about, the different the different epidemiological studies. It's like, this is in like the Journal of Epidemiology, and but it was funny because they clearly thought that I was sufficiently articulate that they didn't want to deal with it themselves, but they didn't want to tell me that I was going to have to deal with somebody else. As far as as far as friends and such, that was interesting because I had, I think, two of my friends supported my campaign, which was not a lot, and that was frustrating. And but I raised more money than any other any other Republican not any other, all other Republican congressional candidates in Massachusetts that time combined. And so it was like, it did have a lot of resonance. And I think people do actually want people who are going to be honest uh, and speak forthrightly. And I, and that was the only reason that I was running. So there was no reason not to. And I do feel like, I think that it's something that I wish more people would do, because you do have a voice. And I know people hate the raising money and all like that. However, I think it's actually really important because it helps you to understand uh, where other people, what resonates with people. As long as you're not going out and just getting the big donations, I think if you're getting the smaller donations, and in the case of my campaign, it was really all across the country, and lots of small donations in Massachusetts, and that was, I felt bad. I did feel bad withdrawing because I felt like I was leaving them sort of high and dry. But I did refund all of the donations, which the local political party did not appreciate, because they thought they should get them all, even though they hadn't helped me at all. And that's the wonderful thing, actually, about raising your own money and I do think it's important to get it from other people too, not just self-finance. We did some of that, but it means you're not beholden to other people. So they couldn't say, oh, well, I mean, they tried. They said, we'd like you to talk about these three things, which are Trump's platforms. Like, those are the things that I really care about.
Yeah.
That these are the things that I want to talk about, and we'll see if it works. And it's you don't as long as you're not taking the party's money, you don't necessarily have to toe the party line. You can go quite a bit. You can have your own platform, and it is a powerful platform, and it does change the conversation.
And naturally, the policies for Trump's, they're obviously more national for the country. Maybe in Massachusetts, there'll be something a bit more specific and a bit more different. That Trump's is obviously his policy is much more wide for the nation, so you'd have a much better
Yeah.
idea of what's more relevant for Massachusetts, what's the problems going on here specifically. So it makes sense that you get that autonomy to make those own decisions. Otherwise, it renders the whole point of view, your personality as a profile.
What's
Then what's the point? Um,
Well, and what's the point of local representation if everything's a national issue?
yeah, yeah,
That just makes no sense, right? I mean, if you're going to have this like devolved representation at every level, then people should be speaking to the issues that are relevant uh, to the to those people. Although interestingly, one of the reasons that I chose to run as a congressperson is because it does it elevates the conversation. It brought it to a slightly higher level. Realistically, as a congressperson, I couldn't actually impact the policies that I was talking about. So that there is a little bit of, trying to have it both ways there on my part, I will say.
do you see yourself going back into the political arena? Maybe not as congressman in a different role where you maybe have more power to enact some of these policies?
More local. Perhaps at some point, I think I would start much smaller, but in
Right.
the place where you normally would start, maybe school board or something like that. But we're now, I guess we're almost 3 years into our time in Texas, and finally feels like things are sort of settling down, and we've mostly recreated our lives and our friendships and all like that. But it's taken time, and I do think too it's important to get a sense for before jumping into some to politics, get a sense for where it is that the community that you live in, rather than you guys probably don't see this, but it's one of the more frustrating things in the United States is that people will just jump over and run for some office even though they've never spent any time there, just because it's maybe an easier to win race.
It's very
So it's
common
not
in the UK. It's very,
yeah,
very common.
okay,
Very common.
yeah. And that's just I think it's incredibly uh, it's very distasteful because it just feels it reeks of seeking power rather than trying to provide voice.
Where's the state of the Democrats at the moment? I spoke to somebody recently, granted he was a Republican, and he was saying to me how bad the situation is for the Democrats in that not only nationally they obviously had the result that they had, but even at a local level, a lot of their branches have been taken over by a lot of these woke ideologies. So even the traditional Democrats who historically would have been involved in a lot of these associations and doing a lot of the work, they've almost been pushed out. What was your experience like running against the Democrats, and what's their general status like? Because we in the UK we hear very, very little on what's going on in the Democratic Party now.
Um, so so I was running against an extremely well-funded Democrat, but like I said, he yeah basically doesn't. They didn't even engage because they were so well-funded. He was actually Dr. Fauci's number two was his father, and his mother is the head of
Wow.
Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So it was kind of it was a nice little David and Goliath battle. As far as what's happened, I it's hard to tell because it seems like I know what I want to be true. And by the way, I didn't grow like I haven't always been Republican. I voted Democrat for many years. And but when I talk to friends who are and I have a lot of friends who are still very Democrat, they are they are saying it's like I that they don't know what's going to happen to our democracy. They are still kind of in they're still kind of in this propaganda bubble. And I think it's really hard to fix things when that's the bubble that you live in, when you still
Even
think that
even after the election, they're still in.
even
Wow.
after the election, they absolutely still think that it is um, yeah, they think that the defunding of USAID is totally is just completely political, as opposed to the fact that seems to me to be like a giant money laundering operation, and also was the main funding source for the various censorship that was done covertly, that where the government basically funded the NGOs, and then the NGOs put pressure on the social media companies. So for me, I'm looking at this and I think it's amazing and I'm thrilled. But there are a lot of people, and there are a lot of smart people who are. I think it's really hard to it's very hard to change course when you don't recognize that you're actually on the wrong course, when instead you just say, oh well, it's those people who are on the wrong course. And it's sort of, sometimes when you look at clouds, and you're like, oh, that one's moving. You're like, actually, it's the one above that's moving. That one's staying still. It's just a question of perspective. And I, I unfortunately, I think the media diet, if you're getting your information from regular media, it's really hard to come away with any other source of information. I just can't believe that people still do. That's the thing that I find remarkable, but it's definitely um, and I know people talk about how toxic it is on social media, and it's definitely toxic on social media. But the difference is you go into it knowing that. that it's toxic, the information is incomplete, that people are posting things before they've necessarily been sourced, but it does help you to get a way faster grip on what's happening. And as long as you go into everything with total skepticism, then you can, I think you can find a lot of information really, really quickly. And you can also get different opinions and views and test, as long as you have a way of evaluating whether or not they're accurate, then you can hear other sides and you can say, oh, well, I think that side makes some, or this view actually has some merit. Or you could follow it down the rabbit hole a little bit and go, nope, these people are absolutely crazy, which
Yeah.
definitely is the case sometimes. Whereas I don't think that view is being taken at all by people who consume mainstream media. I think it is generally, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, I listen to both sides. And so what they mean is that they say, oh, I've heard Tucker Carlson or somebody on Fox say something, and then but the vast majority of my information is over here. And it's almost like a scale where it's like, oh, well, everything I hear works is like this. So therefore I've listened to both sides, but it's all on this side. It's actually like it's all on the side of the mainstream media. But and I think that's very interesting right now in our AI age, actually, because that's also how AI learns,
Mm.
right? And it's a fairly simplistic way of learning. It is simply, it's like the reason it's real. One of the reasons that AI remains persistently woke and will stay persistently woke until it has its own epistemology. Sorry, um, is because since based on it's giving you the basic the gist that it gets from everything. It's saying, okay, this is everything I've seen. It's not evaluating truth or truth or falsehood. It's evaluating it's a scale, and it gets way more on the woke side. And so it'll give you those kind of crazy answers, and or what we I think we're starting to perceive as crazy. And I think a lot of people do the same thing rather than saying, okay, how would I falsify this? How should I think about that? And I think when you're on something like Twitter, that's required because you're dealing with random people whose credibility is only in the information that they're sharing.
But I think that's like you said, like that's the great thing with Twitter and X. You know that when you're going into these platforms, I think what's really worrying with mainstream media is that they are almost doing the exact same thing, but they're acting as if they are the professionals, as if there's curated news, as if they've actually well sourced it, they've cross-referenced it, they've weighed up the balances, but they're not. They're doing exactly what maybe you and I do on X and these platforms, but they're projecting that as the fundamental fact when we know for multiple times that they've told us so many lies, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. So I find it very surprising and almost worrying that people still don't have that skepticism. I'm not saying everyone should jump on board and agree with yours and mine opinion and go and vote for Trump and be fully on Team MAGA, but at the same time, it worries me that they're not sitting there thinking, okay, we were told, well, in the UK, I can give an example, it was almost if it wasn't for X, every other media outlet across the UK was pretty much saying Kamala Harris will easily win the election. That was the general reoccurring theme, which is Kamala Harris is going to destroy Trump. He's got so many stuff that's going on. There's no way she'll win, and the result was the result. And I find it so crazy to me that the people who had these opinions didn't take away and sit there and think, okay, we've got this really wrong. Maybe we should actually take a step back and listen to why so many ordinary Americans are voting for Trump, why his black following went up, why his Latino following went up, why more women vote, why is he increasing in every metric? But it seems really bizarre that no one in the UK was doing that. I'm guessing by the sound of things, your CNNs in America are not doing the same now.
Well, and it's concerning because it's not just the CNNs, right? It's actually it is sort of the professional managerial class. It's very much, as I say,
I think that's the
it still
crappy part.
remains pretty class based, which is and then of course you have, notable defections like Elon Musk and, Mark Andreessen and various people like that, and that has definitely created some cover. But then of course you see the response is just, oh, well, well, we used to all wear our Teslas as our badge of what good people we are. Now we're putting bumper stickers on to say I bought it before Elon, as if Elon has. To me, it's remarkable to see that shift, like how quickly people decided that they hated Elon. And it started well before the Trump stuff, actually. It started with he was pretty quick on questioning the COVID numbers. Actually, I remember reading a tweet of his that said, if this is growing exponentially, which there's virtually no point, no level to which you can reduce this, that it's not going to take off, because that's how exponential functions work. And it's not a totally exponential function, but it's a largely initially exponential function. And that's I think that's kind of started him down a road, but also got him, once you started questioning the COVID such stuff, it was really, yeah, that's what gets you out. I don't know that believing your own BS is a challenge, and I don't really see, though, what I can't quite figure out is what what the benefit is at this point. And I guess they just haven't, like, they haven't lost enough.
I think that I think them accepting the result and what's happened, I think it would almost make them question so many things I don't think they want to question the trans stuff, just being supportive of that, what's going on in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine. I think it's all just to fit that kind of facade of that they're a really good person, morally virtuous, morally righteous, and to then, if you question one of these things, I think then they're worried that this whole thing, this whole pack of cards will fall down because it's not based on much core principles and values. These are just things that I think the media has made so that, there's a joke in the UK where you almost have to sign like a social contract before you can go on the BBC and lots of media outlets like that, where you have to believe in BLM, you have to be pro LGBTQ, you have to be all these sort of things, then you're allowed to speak on some issues. And I'm guessing it's similar for America as well. And it's worrying because, like I said, this result for me would have been a massive eye opener if you weren't already voting for Trump or were one of those people who were just so anti him, to sit there and think, okay, why is his numbers? He won in 2016, lost in 2020, he's won again. People have gone back to him. There's clearly a reason why. Why don't we try and figure this out and work it out, even if you don't want to agree with him at the end? But it seems like people are refusing to even start that thought process.
Well, because they've got easy answers, right? The easy answer is, it's like, well, America's a racist country, and it's just because they're all these racists, especially those the yeah, what is it, the blackface of white supremacy, and that sort of stuff. I think that it's yeah, it's because those answers are given, there's not a whole lot of asking, like, well, why. They take the answers on faith, although I wrote a piece fairly shortly after the election saying, if you, so there's this huge denial of the censorship that was going on, and that has been being affected. And I think that I sort of viewed the censorship as the get out of jail free card for the people who have been wrong for the last 5 years on pretty much everything. But instead, they've just said, "Oh no, there's no censorship. That's a lie. That's another right wing talking point." But it's not. I mean, it's really well documented at this point, and it absolutely shaped the narrative. And so my comment was, if you don't think, if you don't think censorship is harmful, you know, you should look again at this election. This election, censorship brought you Donald Trump. And the reason you're surprised that you have Donald Trump is, as you said, because of the censorship. Because the censorship, coupled with the other side, the propaganda on the other side of the coin, made it so people just didn't believe that was even possible. And so they didn't have a proper primary, and they shut down all the voices that said, "Oh, Joe's too old." And then same thing, just denied everybody the voice that was saying, Kamala's not a great candidate, guys. And that was it. So to me, it's a perfect example of being hoodwinked, and why you should really start to dislike the censorship. But instead, even for people who really wanted him, or who wanted a Democratic governor, but that's not that's not the that's not the lesson that has been taken. The lesson has been taken that, well, we need to censor harder. We need to help make people it's not the message. It's the way we're delivering it, or it's the fact that other messages can get through. And it's I think it's really it's I mean it's crazy. And I think it would be much more useful to say, oh well, why did you vote for Trump? Well, I voted for Trump because uh, I I view the institutions that have that they that have that we're supposed to revere have failed and have become so incredibly prone to failure as to become just utterly, like, actively harmful. And so I think it's similar to that kind of Warren of Lies thing, that it's they're all interconnected, and they've created this false reality that is not creating good outcomes. It's creating really bad outcomes. And so I think that what people need to realize is that if people are going to have any trust in these institutions again, we need to be honest about what has happened. And we need to say, that so let's take an institution like the institution of science. And that is supposed to be something that seeks towards truth, but instead of being a mechanism for for getting closer and closer to the truth, and getting a better and better understanding, it's been perverted to largely be used to provide credibility for lies.
Mm.
And that was certainly what happened throughout COVID. The amount of just terrible scientific research that came out that was then propped up by scientific journalists, by scientists themselves. That is what makes people not trust people. And so until people can say, yes, this happened, and this is what we're going to do to fix it, they won't. They're not going to trust those institutions, and that's why the people should be the people who are these big institutionalists should be thrilled with something like Doge, because it transparency will allow people to have more trust in how their tax dollars are spent and in those institutions. I mean, I don't want to spend any more taxes on things that are where every single dollar seems to have a net negative gain. But if you started to show me, this is why we had all these bad outcomes. This is why, the more money we spend on Medicare and Medicaid, the worse people's health gets. We're fixing that. Then, okay, I'll be okay with you raising my taxes. But until you start to show me some sort of cost benefit, like some sort of improvement, I mean, there's no return on investment for us. Literally every dollar the more we spend, the worse the outcomes get. And that, I think, is the opportunity. That's the thing that people are missing, is that the people who dislike the institutions, it's not that they dislike the institutions in and of themselves. It's that they dislike the behavior we saw, how they were used to to launder in an authoritarian state under the guise of equity and various other things like that's. And until people will acknowledge that that's what happened and say, here's what we're going to do to fix it, nobody's going to trust those institutions.
These institutions outright lied. It's the same in the UK. They outright lied. We have Group Sage, who were doing a lot of the medical stuff during COVID. They outright lied, and it was repeated and
Constantly.
repeated. And even unfortunately, we're not one of the things that's very frustrating in the UK with both political parties, the Conservatives and Labour. Unlike, I think, America, where you have a Trump and you have this incredible new administration. In the UK, I think our mainstream parties have both essentially failed the UK, and neither of them are prepared to sit there and say, we've made some mistakes. We need to reevaluate the institutions we trusted. Instead, they're doubling down on these institutions. They're almost protecting them and almost trying to protect their own credibility, even though their own credibility has just been shot to death. And they'd actually gain more credibility if they just came out and said, we got it wrong. These institutions have got it wrong, and we want to do a Doge-like kind of approach where, you know, we want to actually make sure the information we're getting is correct. We want it to be efficient. We want people to pay less on tax. So it's really, I think, the great thing in America, there seems to be a real optimism with the new administration. Is that a fair comment? Can you see that across Texas, for example? Is there this sort of following the result and everything that he's done in the last 2 months? Is this feeling of excitement in America?
and some groups, and despair in others. And the despair, I think, is just, like I said, I find it odd. It's like, why are you upset about an audit? Like, isn't this great? Like I said, I'll pay more taxes if you tell me that if you show me that it's actually gonna have a good return. You can have, we can have all the crazy programs, except for the gender transition for minors. Um, but we can do, I mean, we could do so many things with the amount of money. I mean, it's just like, and instead it just ends up getting, it does just sort of seem like the federal government and the bureaucracy especially is a money laundering operation. And I don't think, and certainly with the stimulus that we did. I mean, like literal trillions of dollars of stimulus that the way that money works, ended up just it percolates up to the people who deploy it most effectively, and so it ended up where the richest people got substantially richer, and then everybody else was had to suffer the cost of inflation, and it is it's bizarre. So to me, just the idea of not wanting to figure out how to make things more efficient, because obviously they're clearly inefficient, and more to the point, maybe they're so inefficient that the government shouldn't be involved. It seems like that there might be some role for government in some of these programs, but as they currently are, like every single additional expenditure makes things worse. You look at like Obamacare, right? Like it was supposed to make things cheaper. I mean, the graph looks like this. I mean, it's absolutely everything has gotten more expensive. And understanding the mechanisms through that. And it's not all graph. There are lots of different ways of there are lots of different kinds of graph too. One of the ways people do it is they lobby the government to say, oh well, we have to have this kind of procedure covered by this. And then all of a sudden that's got to be covered, and it may or may not be beneficial, and it completely shuts out the private market. And then you might have somebody who would offer it for cheaper, but that's not going to happen anymore. And so they can keep their prices incredibly high. um, yeah, it's very frustrating. But yeah, in some parts there's a lot of optimism. In other parts there is despair. And then I think there are other areas where it's just a bit lackadaisical, which I think is certainly much more healthy than despair.
Well, I think, Europe in general is like absolutely, I think a lot of Europe anyway is an absolute envy of America with the election result. And you even forget about political views. You look at the profiles of people in Trump's administration, the caliber of their careers and what they've done, and you compare it to some of the ones, for example, in the UK in our current administration. You can't even compare the profiles, the experience that the US cabinet has in real life experience, starting businesses, being in the army. There's such a wide depth of experience within that. And then the UK one, where it's essentially just career politicians who just they have no other job other than just being in politics. And it really is, I think, quite concerning for us with these liberals in America who are still angry with the result, still frustrated with the result. Do you see any kind of changes on the media channels? Because there was for a few days where in the UK we started seeing stuff. I can't think of the exact show, but there was examples of almost like a softening on the LGBTQ stance. So they were almost moving away from the gender craziness that's been going on in the West for the last 10, 20 years. But there seemed to be like almost they were moving away from that. Has there been that kind of social shift in the media where they're starting to, I wouldn't say not maybe not say peak wokeness, but almost are we seeing a bit of a change in those trends?
I think that in terms of what you see around you, and I actually want to follow up on what you were saying earlier, but we'll go back to that and try and help me remember that. Um, the I think it has softened somewhat. The political parties are really, or the Democrats are really struggling with moderating on that. I know that the few people who have made fairly obvious statements, like one of the Congress people in Massachusetts said, "Well, I would be upset to have my daughters competing against a man, and he got absolutely obliterated for it. And he's got his Democratic bona fide, so they're really making it very challenging to be able to challenge that orthodoxy. I do feel like people are realizing that it's no longer a winning proposition from a commercial perspective. So you're really seeing that roll back, and that I think that would be that will make a difference. I think what's going to have to happen is where you have some people like some significant some real stars start to fall. Like if you had, I heard a rumor. I have no knowledge whatsoever of the truth of it, that like the Nicole Shanahan might be running for governor of California. If Nicole Shanahan takes down Gavin Newsom, that's like a significant loss of power. So, and yeah, the presidency goes back and forth, but if you have some real flipping of states, and that's a completely different kind of flip than the Rust Belt flip, right? That's this kind of, there's this new populism that is, and there's such a big difference to this kind of new right populism versus left populism. And the way I understand it is the new right populism is, and I would probably call myself part of that, though I think that's very odd because I don't think I like register as a populist, but it's because the kind of populism is, it's not saying I want the government to provide for me and do provide all these services. It's that the expertise that the government is shoving down my throat is absolutely, and just from all over, not just the government, but the institutions generally is wrong. And like they're wrong all the time. And actually there's this sense that actually we just did that the form of the populism is very much uh, just anti-authority and it is anti-institution, but as it's at anti-institution as the institutions are currently behaving, not even as they're currently constituted, as they're currently behaving. Whereas left populism is all about saying, oh well, we'll just give you all this stuff, we'll help you, like, or promising to that the government will provide. And I think that there are a lot of people in the past 5 years have realized that when the government gets involved, the government wants control, and that just means other people are going to have control, and they don't want to give that up. One of the things you hear a lot here is, why are these poor, particularly they'd say like poor whites, not voting their interests like the blacks are. And I think it's because the poor whites look at the poor blacks and say, that doesn't seem to be working very well for them. The government providing for you seems to be decimating you. Um, and so I think there's this pretty big difference with that. I did want to ask you though, going back to what you were saying about the politicians. So I read the Telegraph pretty regularly, and I don't get that sense. Actually, so my question isn't about the politicians. It's, do you have a sense amongst like normal people that there isn't this just like utter catastrophizing and fear of Trump? Because like even the Telegraph, which is obviously like sort of nominally conservative, is there are people who are, it's mostly freaked out to me.
Yeah, see the thing with Trump is it's interesting. There's lots of different polling on it, and the UK polling is really, it's very
Like all
questionable.
the
Yeah, like,
yeah.
oh, exactly. It's very questionable. And even to be honest, the Telegraph, it is traditionally a more conservative paper, but I think the last 4 or 5 years, I think that you could question how much of it really has been conservative, but it is definitely still more than conservative. Trump's an interesting one because um, polling wise or just general view, he's not that liked in the UK. I think just naturally British people tend to be a bit more politer and just that general the bravado they don't really like as much, and that kind of his showman style and that kind of stuff. I don't think it resonates a lot with Brits in general. That yeah, so yeah, we're a lot more boring, and we prefer the boring approach. So I don't think he necessarily is as popular. That said, they did something on his policies. So they just they didn't say his name, they just showed his policies in the UK, and it was overwhelmingly supportive, overwhelmingly positive. So the Trump pretty much they went through like his top 10 policies he's done in his first term and this term, and it was overwhelmingly the British majority agreed with stuff like controlling border, very quite normal kind of stuff. And so his policies are very, very popular, I think, amongst working class Brits. But the reality is, he will. I don't think he will ever be popular with our media outlets just because of who he is, just because of the fact that he got arrested in the US, the fact that he's had cases against him, he's gone bankrupt. There is no way I think the British media will ever let that go. Just the way that the way the country is in a way. I think if you ask a lot of people deep down, I think a lot of them don't really care about that stuff, and I think a lot of them would be able to um, see through some of that stuff. But saying you're a Trump supporter, me saying publicly I'd vote Trump this election, last election, I am definitely in the minority, and there's not too many that would outright say that kind of statement. Instead, they would probably say something more along the lines, even the conservative ones, which is I like all of Trump's policies, not so keen on his character, but he's probably the best thing for America. That's the best you'll get for a Trump thing. So yeah, he's in the UK. I think the thing that's really in his favor is how bad the current UK government is and how bad they're doing. So I think a lot of people are looking at America, and you're seeing this optimism. You're seeing the way JD Vance and Trump are. You're seeing Elon Musk. You're seeing all these profiles of people, and there's a lot of I think envy in some ways.
I hope we all get people who are more representative. It is frustrating watching the European elections and seeing that even when you do have more insurgent parties come up with significant majorities, that they're kept out of the governments, right? Like that in France, yeah, and in Germany, where the parties that got the most votes or the second most votes will not be are not don't have any power within the government, and that's just it's remarkable when we're talking about how important it is to for our democracies, but then when we get democratic responses, we don't want to take them into account, and it's so I hope you guys uh, get lucky. I think my read on Starmer was that the COVID policies were so bad that whoever was in power, they should have got kicked out. I was surprised that Biden didn't in 2020, and for me that was one of the easiest votes I've ever had. It was because it was just voting. I'm just voting against perpetual mask mandates and vaccine mandates and just any kind this medical tyranny that just won't leave and that puts bureaucrats in charge of everybody. But I think what happened is whatever. I do think that the way I don't think the election was illegitimate, but I do think that the way that power ran through and things were funded, and the way that uh, I don't think it was. I think it was a little screwy, but I don't think that was the main issue. I think the biggest issue is that people really. It just took such a long time for the lies to kind of be recognized as lies, and I think that so many people were just not hadn't caught up and realized what was happening by November of 2020. And it really wasn't until kind of like, um, I mean, gosh, it even feels like it's starting more like 24. So I think that maybe, you guys got, yeah, the Tories got booted out because they acted very yeah, well, maybe they acted very Tory-like, but they didn't act very like they didn't adhere to their stated values. And
Definitely, definitely. It's a big problem in the UK where everyone will say there's nothing conservative about the Conservative Party. It's a reoccurring line. Like it's a very the difference between Labour and Conservatives right now is barely anything. During COVID, Labour were pretty much supportive of every Conservative policy. In fact, they wanted to go further. It was a very very, very bizarre time. And that's why Reform, or almost a new party must come out of nowhere, are doing so popular. They're winning every single poll, and they're doing really, really well because unlike I think where Trump has come in and basically just shaken up the Republican Party, the Conservative Party and Labour Party, no one's done that for either side, and so it's just more. I think at that stage, anyone that ran against the Conservative Party in the last election, you were going to win. People were just so sick of the Conservative Party 14 years and that kind of resentment. And Sir Keir Starmer won, despite only getting less than 20% of the whole country's vote. So people were just very disillusioned and angry. And it's yeah, I think it's concerning. I think the good news is when you look across the pond and you see the what you guys have what you've done with in selecting Trump and the way he won in particular is amazing. So be very very exciting for you guys. We have like a closing ritual on this show that we do every single time, which is what is an unpopular opinion you have that you think should be popular? So it can be something that we've already discussed. It can be completely different, but what is an unpopular opinion that Emily has that Emily thinks should be popular?
People should get married earlier and have kids way earlier and more of them.
This is crazy because this is about podcasts since I've done this new series about number 24, and I think you're about the sixth or seventh person that said this. So
Interesting.
it's a definite and you're the
Well,
first who
it's not unpopular. Darn
yeah
it.
yeah. You're the
I'm just
you're the second American, so it's not like you're like it's been a very I've had an Australian say this. It's been very yeah everyone's been saying so it's a very interesting one, but it shows like I think it shows that even is now considered potentially an unpopular opinion, whereas I don't think maybe 20 years ago that would have been.
That's probably, well, I don't know. When I was growing up, there was definitely this, yeah, like you should wait to have children and all like that. And I didn't have wait that far, but I really, I hope my children are able to have children earlier, and that we will be, we'll be involved as grandparents and such like that. And I do think just recognizing that that aspect of your life is really important. You need you need careers, but you also need um, like the kids are really important. And I think that particularly for women, realizing your lives are quite long, and as long as you're well educated, and like that motherhood is not this um, like void where you're not doing anything and you're not thinking. Actually, quite to the contrary, you're managing a bunch of sometimes crazy little people whom you can't fire no matter how bad they are, which is very different from when you're running a company. You can fire the people when they really don't work out. Kids, you're kind of stuck with them. So
Oh, amazing. That's a nice way to end the show. Thank you for your time, Emily.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.